Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the In Stride Podcast. This week we have our first guest on, Dr. Andrew Koutnik, a scientist who specializes in the roles nutrition, exercise, and stress play in the metabolic health of individuals, and is living with type 1 diabetes himself as well. We learn about Andrew's diagnosis story and get a deeper look into some of the research he is pursuing. If you're finding these podcasts interesting or useful, please drop us a like or a follow on any of our social media platforms and check out our website to learn more. Additionally, we have just created the InStride T1D subreddit to start building our community and sharing our collective experiences overcoming challenges with all things type 1 diabetes. You can find this subreddit under InStride_T1D on Reddit. Join us there in addition to our other social media channels. On to the episode.
Hey everyone, here we are again at the In Stride Podcast. Today we have a special guest, a friend of mine that we've met I think a year ago or so in Santa Barbara when he was working at the Samson Diabetes Research Clinic. We were introduced by a mutual friend there, and we just really hit it off. And Andrew's a type 1 diabetic, a researcher focusing on nutrition, exercise, how stressors affect the metabolism. He focuses on a range of populations from metabolically hurt people, type 1 diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and elite athletes. And so he does a lot of interesting research to kind of see how different nutritional protocols affect the athlete, affect the person living with diabetes. And we're thrilled to have him on the podcast here to kind of pick his brain. But most of all, Andrew is also, as I said just a minute ago, a type 1 diabetic. He's kicking butt with the disease. He is totally taking it on. And that's really what we hit it off with when we met in Santa Barbara. And I just really want to hear his story, his diagnosis story, and his lessons learned. And we'll get into his research a little bit. And Andrew, before you get going, one of the reasons I was excited to bring you on is because the first 3 podcasts we did was actually leading up to a bike race that Alex and Justin participated in called the Unbound 200. And as you probably know, the elite endurance athlete nutritional protocol today, and this is, it's getting crazy, is just absolutely consuming massive amounts of carbohydrates per hour. So Justin and Alex both, just went off of the current sports science research saying, hey, to maximize effort, this is your nutritional protocol. One of the things that we've always done as type 1 diabetics, as professional cyclists, is saying, hey, what's the current sports science tell us to maximize our performance? And then we adjust our insulin delivery protocols to meet the needs of those recommendations. And so here we are, Justin, Alex, fueling, I think, 150 grams of carbs per hour over Justin's race at the pro level was just over 10 hours, I think. So
Just under.
Just under 10 hours, sorry.
Man, short, Jeez, man.
So that's a massive amount of carbohydrate intake. One of the elite Tour de France cyclists, Ben Healy, I think, was reported consuming like 1,000 grams of carbohydrates a day. So just massive amounts of carbohydrates. It works. These guys are going fast. Justin's racing at Gravel World this weekend, and so this nutrition protocol is working. But I remember you and I talked a lot about fasted training, low carb training back in Santa Barbara. And I know that you talked a lot about that on other podcasts. So I thought, this could be a topic that Andrew could come on and we could hear another side of the coin, right? Because what I found with type 1 diabetes is it's not a silver bullet creating success. There's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different science. So it's really just kind of trial and error, find out what works for you, find out what other people are doing and what works for them. But I want to quit rambling, Andrew, and hear your story. Let's start out with your diabetes journey first.
Yeah, and I'll make it brief because I know we want to get to the meat of what you were talking about before. So I'm actually really excited about this podcast. It's very rare that you actually have legit athletes with type 1 diabetes on top of that who actually can speak to their own personal experience on this topic, because usually I'm seen as very antagonistic to this. Although I think we might unravel that a little bit more. So I'm excited for this. So my personal diabetes story started on a trip to Washington, D.C. with my family. Right before we got on the airplane, until I asked Florida going to Washington, D.C. My stomach got turned over. I started feeling really nauseous. Long story short, felt extreme levels of fatigue. The typical story, people drinking tons of water. I was drinking, I believe, I counted 12 to 14 glasses of TGI Fridays, Red Lobster style glasses. So I don't know if this is video recorded or not, typical a glass full. And I was drinking all of that within a 1 to 2 hour period. More like a 2.5 hour period, actually. But either way, 14 hours of throwing up, and ended up in the hospital, thankfully, because we didn't know what it was, but we called my grandmother, who's a nurse, and she said, go to the ER now. Went to the ER, my blood sugar was 596 milligrams per deciliter. If you want to convert that to millimoles in different parts of the world, that's just about 6 times the normal amount of blood sugar floating around in the circulation. Found out that my body was attacking the beta cells that produce insulin. And of course, here I am, now 16 going on 17 years post that diagnosis. And it kind of really framed the entire journey of my life to this point, honestly, going from the diagnosis forward.
Yeah, man, that's so cool. Like, one of the reasons I like to hear people, I mean, it's so funny. My knee-jerk response is to say, "Hey, that's so cool." Whenever I meet another type 1 diabetic out in the wild, I say, "Oh, awesome!" It's like I gotta stop that.
No, you don't, man. That's what it's all about. No. I want to debunk that. That's what it's all about. I do the same thing, and people, I'm like, well, I have to stop myself because they're probably like, they're supposed to be mad about this. You don't have to be mad about it. I am fully a fundamental believer, and I'm a little bit antagonistic to other people, that type 1 diabetes has become one of the greatest assets of my life, besides my wife, besides my parents. They had the biggest impact on my life, now my children. But type 1 diabetes gives an ultimate superpower to people if they want it. It gives you the ultimate resolution into your own metabolism, the most powerful hormone of all metabolism you have complete control over. You also have insights into glucose and insulin, the 2 most powerful molecules in all of metabolism, 24/7, minute by minute of every single day, every single meal for the rest of your life. That can be a curse. It can also be the greatest asset of all time. Keep in mind that no advanced laboratory, and I've worked with some of them, in the world has that type of resolution on your metabolism. And you have complete control over it, manipulating metabolic pathways up and down at any single insulin pump infusion to any injection you may take. So the idea that it's an ultimate curse or this devastating thing that can happen, yeah, it is, if it's seen that way, but it can also be one of the greatest assets of all time. So I just want to make sure that is stated.
I think you might have been listening or heard our conversations from everything we've said in the past, because that's pretty much exactly all, our whole mentality is like, hey, we have this thing, but as we were mentioning, right, Dustin and I just did this 200-mile bike race, and literally spent the 6 months leading up to that going, how can I tweak the carb intake versus my insulin dosage and things like that to like really just maximize performance? For me, obviously, I'm a has-been pro cyclist, so my time was a lot longer, right? But that means 3 extra hours of riding. You got to have some energy. And so managing the diabetes, I mean, so it's so cool to hear you say that as well. And, when you talk about your diabetes diagnosis, like everybody, I think, has a very similar one. And that's just another like nice thing to hear. Is like, you know what? There's a shared experience there, and it kind of shows that we can like really just learn from other people. And kind of doing a little bit of research on what you're doing too. And kind of some of the stuff you've published. Some different approaches than we have, which kind of, as Nathan was saying, right? Not a one size fits all, but lots of what fits your lifestyle, what do you need, and what are your goals, and how do you use all of this information that we have, constant knowledge on insulin dosage and blood sugars and trend graphs and, historical data and things like that. Like, you can really use that to just manipulate for success.
And I also want to state, I think a lot of times people don't realize in type 1 diabetes, there is an actual potential advantage. Obviously, the downsides are very clear for anyone who's lived with type 1 diabetes. You don't have the automation. Imagine every single time that you go to pick up your phone, instead of just picking up your smartphone and clicking, 2 or 3 buttons, you had to write code, 50, 60, hundreds of lines of code. Every single time you had to make a phone call. That's essentially what we do with type 1 diabetes. Every single time we go to eat a meal, every single time we go into exercise, we're thinking through that code, making decisions on our own on what we're going to do, usually at every meal, every exercise bout, often meals within exercise bouts, to figure out what we're going to do with our own metabolism. And you are forced to become essentially a world expert on nutrition, exercise, glucose, and insulin, whether you like it or not. And if you ignore it, it doesn't go very well. But if you pay attention to it, it can be a great asset. Kind of like the idea that in type 1 diabetes, where you peripherally inject insulin, and it goes to the peripheral tissues, that's often seen as a very terrible thing. Oh no, you have elevated levels of insulin in your peripheral vasculature. In almost every setting, that causes insulin resistance just by the high levels that are present. However, in type 1 diabetes, it also means that the muscle tissue is hypersaturated with insulin, around 2 to 3-fold more than your liver is. So you're actually seeing the muscle tissue is seeing insulin, is seeing glucose, is taking it up predominantly more so than the liver. And it gives an opportunity for people with type 1 diabetes to leverage this disease to an advantage, particularly in athletic context. But as a close friend of mine, we have a podcast as well around type 1 diabetes, Max Domi. He's a professional hockey player with a Toronto Maple Leafs. He says there's a big asterisk with that because it's not so simple, right? It means you have to put additional work in. But if you do, great opportunity comes from that.
Yeah, man. So I love that. That's right in line with what we've been experiencing and what we're trying to say. It's funny, in the early days of Teen Type 1, we would be in front of a lot of kids with diabetes, and they, people would ask, oh, how do you do the thing? And we would always say, I think half believing what we were saying is like, oh, we have the advantage. And come to find out from research like you're putting in, just the experience of little things that we hear now, all these non-type 1 diabetics using CGMs and gaining great insights, learning how to fuel themselves. It turns out like, oh, wait, we actually did have the advantage. I half believed it. Now I fully believe it. One of the analogies, Andrew, that I've been using lately is, being a type 1 diabetic athlete is like you're driving a manual transmission. You're not stuck with a crappy automatic. But to your point, it comes with a caveat, right? Anybody who's tried to drive a manual transmission car knows that to actually do it right, to be able to, rev match and double clutch, you actually have to train yourself how to do that. Like anybody who's an elite race car driver has spent hours practicing those techniques, and somebody who's never done it before is going to stall the car out. And so, yes, you've got to put the work in, but once you master the technique, oh man, you have a massive advantage over those athletes stuck with the crappy automatics.
Yeah. Or they, yes, I'll leave it at that. I was going to go into a controversial realm. I'll just say some people can try to leverage it, but they have to do a whole hell of a lot to get to that point. Within type 1 diabetes, it comes with the territory. You just have to do it. You have to manage glucose, meals, insulin, and everything that comes along with it to try to make the most of it and to get the just normal glycemic control. But in athletics, it has a whole nother level of opportunity, but also comes with its difficulties, as I'm sure Justin and Alex can speak to, as they're elite and Nathan as well. Elite current or former athletes doing this. So yeah.
Yeah. So you said something so cool. Nathan, sorry, you don't mind. I'm gonna jump in here, knowing that I gotta drop a little quicker and leave the actual fun conversation to you guys as we're going. But you were talking, and I'm curious to hear your take a little bit before I have to jet on some of the new technologies that have popped out, right? Like you're talking about, having to manage all these things at mealtime and things we've done for. I was diagnosed in 2001, right? So I was on NPH at the time. Still had to snack at 10:30 a.m. and noon and all these things, and now I'm using like an open source looping system from my phone, and the amount until I pick back up in cycling, I didn't even have to think about diabetes except for changing my CGM and pod, right, and still have like pretty good control. So, but now that I've learned back into the sports, back into cycling a bit, again we still have this manipulation, but I'm kind of curious on your take and how you see. Some of these really cool advancements, or I guess I'm calling them cool advancements, but that might be just my perspective. Yeah.
So when it comes to the technology, anyone with type 1 diabetes, this is the one thing about type 1 diabetes communities. They're very keenly aware of how they come. But we actually did a look about 200 years back as to what was the focus of the diabetes clinical physician community over the last 200 years. And, when we look back, or actually around 200 years ago, 19 1796, nutrition was the standard of care, right? That's because you didn't have insulin, you didn't have glucose management. In fact, the only way to find out if someone actually had diabetes is actually kind of a sounds gross, but you would actually have to pee and actually drink the urine and actually taste the sweetness in the urine to determine if someone actually had diabetes. That was how it was diagnosed before. Or in some countries where you'd have to urinate on the ground, you wait till it dried, you actually see insects congregate around it. These sound like wives' tales. These were realities. And so that's how it was discovered before. And all the focus at that time was, standard of care at that time was these very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets and or what they call starvation diets, because they were actually starving at the time. They were starved individuals who were diagnosed with this disease because the only way to extend life in these patients is to prevent full-fledged hyperglycemia to unmanageable levels, ketoacidosis to unmanageable levels. And that would actually save sometimes days, months, and sometimes years for patients. Then they discovered in the pre-insulin, the early 1900s, that you could actually give food. You could actually give fat, sometimes marginal amounts of protein, and still give nourishment to a degree in the absence of insulin and just extend the life of patients. It was life-saving at the time. However, in the advent of insulin, this is now 1921, Nobel Prize discovery, Toronto, Banting, Best, and McLeod and others who actually contributed to this, they discovered that in the advancement of insulin, you could inject insulin, rapidly gain weight, one of the most important discoveries of all of medical history, actually. And of course, saved the lives of patients, gave them years on our life. And it's why we're all sitting here speaking years after our diagnosis, right? But from that point forward, actually, I worked, and Nathan, I was at that time with the institute founded by a guy named William Sansom. Now, at the time, standard of care was nutrition. It was medical nutrition therapy. And William Sansom argued that you need to get away from these low carbohydrate kind of term starvation diets and focus on high carb diets. He believed that they would be beneficial. And so William Sansom actually promoted that in a Journal of American Medical Association, 1926. And then it became kind of standard of care from that point forward. And so then there became insulins, different types of insulins. You saw the advancement that came out and different types of technologies, from continuous glucose monitors or just a single stick of blood from your finger that looked the size of a textbook, actually, then get consolidated to smaller and smaller sizes. And then you had this ability to stick a cannula into the peripheral tissues of your body and get a very good and increasingly more accurate assessment of your blood glucose levels, which have become only more accurate. In fact, the technologies are not actually that much more advanced. It's the algorithms behind them that are so much better at actually predicting, because it's a indirect measure of circulating glucose level. But the algorithms at predicting and telling you, the end user, what your real blood sugar is remarkably better. And that's really what distinguishes different forms of CGMs, is really the algorithms, less so much the technology itself. Then beyond CGMs or continuous glucose monitoring is these insulin pumps or infusions. So a lot of people would be stuck with just injecting. At that one time, this was actually metal, big syringes you would boil after every single use. However, we got to the point where we had disposable syringes, and then we got to the point where there's insulin pumps. So you could actually stick a cannula in the body, and you could actually infuse insulin into the body. Something that was only seen in laboratory settings was now accessible to all patients at all times. Now, you actually had the ability of these interactive technologies where they interact with the continuous glucose monitor and the insulin together through computer algorithms, which are, I think, becoming more and more advanced and more insightful. Although I would contend that it's not the end all be all. I think all these technologies are incredibly powerful and have made the management of type 1 diabetes profoundly less burdensome. They're universally helpful for most people, but the degree to which they help you is largely based on the person and how much they actually put into leveraging these technologies to make them as powerful as they could be. And that means focusing on lifestyle interventions alongside that includes nutrition and also includes exercise. So the technology is always at the forefront of type 1 diabetes and has been for years. But that doesn't mean that negates the person from contributing to their success. In fact, I would argue that technologies only move the needle. They give you incredible opportunities that if you put the effort in, you can have incredible outcomes. But by themselves, if you do nothing, only slightly move the needle. But if you put effort in, can dramatically transform outcomes.
I think Alex really discovered that when he got back into cycling, and he put a huge race on his calendar to get back into the sport, and then was like, okay, wow, I got to start really paying attention to this thing again and work with this new technology. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but I remember hearing you talk about this, so it just supports what Andrew's saying. And I mean, when you really dug into the system you were using, the closed loop system you were doing, I mean, you dialed it in to just an amazing result at Unbound. I mean, it was really cool to see.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I was going to say it's an important nuance, right? To say that, yeah, it definitely takes the person to make the technology work, right? Having had diabetes for 25 plus years at this point and going through the paces and learning all the new technologies, right? I had that background to be able to say, hey, I have this closed loop system. When I wasn't like trying to get back into cycling, no joke, my solution was I would change my Omnipod and put on a new Dexcom every 3 to 10 days, right? Depending on the schedule. It has an unannounced meals feature, kept my A1C under 6.5 without doing anything except for changing, the devices, which was really cool having experienced the alternative, right? Where you just have to be like finger sticks 10, 15 times a day and being like super diligent. It was kind of a nice break for a while, but getting back into cycling, I was like, well, this is great, but it doesn't quite do the right job when I'm trying to, push my limits for 6, 10, 12 hours on a bike. And so then it really comes down to, okay, what's happening? How do I look at this? Where do I make adjustments? And it was a really, honestly, for me, a really cool experience, right? Just going, this is how I can modify these profiles. This is how I do this. And, one of the, coolest things, or the things that I was most excited about it with Unbound in particular, and I'm going to leave it with this because I got to drop here, but was, actually adding more insulin into my system for the first handful of hours of the race with a goal of preventing that glycogen response to come out or like delaying the glycogen release, because I was terrified that if I only had 6 hours of that, I'm going to get to 12, 13, 14 hours and just, completely explode. So you can see that in the graph a little bit, where you can see where it kind of ticks up.
So, Alex, you're jumping off at the worst time, man. Because this is the worst. It's the worst. You shouldn't have done it.
I know.
This is where it gets into the controversial area. Because actually, when you look at the historical literature over 100 years back, when someone administers high levels of carbohydrates and insulin goes high, you paradoxically break down glycogen levels. You don't spare them. This is an actual paradox in the literature. So when people consume more and more carbohydrates, they think, oh, I'm sparing my muscle glycogen for that sprint I need later, or for when I need to use it for a sprint, or at some point in the race where I need to give a more anaerobic style effort. But what we see historically in the literature, because we just completed the largest analysis ever conducted across not just type 1, but all athletes going back over 100 years, 160 different studies, the largest meta-analysis, actually multiple meta-analysis in one. And it will be published soon. When you look at the literature, when you ingest higher levels of carbohydrates, in fact, they've done this in ecological settings out in the field, they've done this in laboratory settings through carbohydrate ingestion, and they've done it from dose-dependent responses. The higher the carbohydrates, the higher the insulin. When insulin is high, it shuts down fat oxidation. So what happens? What do you rely on? You rely on your muscle glycogen then to actually start breaking down glucose. Why? Because insulin is infinitely more potent at the fat cell. So you shut down fat oxidation predominantly before you shut down anything in the muscle. Once you shut down fat oxidation in the fat cell, you're relying on the energy from the muscle. So then you break down glycogen faster. In fact, what we've seen is historical literature from some of my collaborators is that when you actually start conducting exercise at controlled settings where you give higher levels of carbohydrates, you give the same, your body adapts rapidly and gives out the same amount of output for exercise. It just shifts where the level of fuel is coming from. So instead of doing it from fat, you're actually just breaking down more glycogen faster and utilizing more. So this is where it becomes a paradox, because people believe that carbohydrate oxidation is more efficient, and we can get into that. But I know you have the jet out.
Yeah. So I'm now you're right. I am really super bummed. I'm like, man, this is the most interesting part. But I know these guys have listened to me ramble on about this for a really long time, so they'll probably be able to unpack
we will let Andrew keep talking, and you can come back and listen, Alex, because I think there's definitely some wisdom to glean here. Because
I agree.
Like you said, there's paradoxing in the recommendations and what we think we know. That's what's so cool about talking to Andrew, who's been looking very closely at this because he is an athlete. And are you out of here? All right.
Yeah, I'm dropping. Thanks, guys.
Cool, man. Thanks, Alex.
So to kind of expound a little bit beyond that point, because That is historical dogma, that you give more carbohydrates. And here's the thing. We've known since 1921 carbohydrates improve performance. I'm definitely not here. Like I can tell you, we looked at all the literature, and they definitely help. Now, what comes into question is how much helps and why does it help? That is a controversy that I don't think people actually appreciate is a real controversy because a lot of the literature and studies we've done historically, we're largely just trying to uncover, do these diets that have this profound potential to normalize glucose control. I mean, get less than a 5.7% HbA1c, normal glucose levels, time and range over 80% with these low carbohydrate or very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, which are controversial in this space. But a lot of people actually do them in type 1 to normalize glucose control. We know that it's possible. And we'll come out with one of the largest analysis on that as well in type 1 diabetes, looking at the largest cohort of about 46,000 patients with type 1 diabetes and showing the impact of different dose responses and glycemic control and type 1 diabetes, just in general, outside of the athletic context. But focusing back in on the athletic context, when you give, let's start with why do we have the high carbohydrate recommendation? Let's start with that. So let's actually turn the dial back over 100 years. So back in the Olympic Berlin Games in the 1800s, late 1800s, high protein diets were standard. That was how it was. That was the approach. That's what everyone did. But then with this emergence of evidence, so actually in the Boston Marathon, these researchers out of Harvard were actually looking at, okay, these athletes are showing up. These aren't type 1 athletes, by the way, just regular athletes. We're doing marathons. And halfway through the marathon, someone would just stop. They would be pale. They would have slurred speech. They would have their cognition was clearly declined. And as we know, as athletes with type 1, that's hypoglycemia. These athletes were getting exercise-induced hypoglycemia. Now, they call this the constituents of metabolites and this constituents of substrates in the blood. Look this up, 1925 and 1926, JAMA, J-A-M-A. And Gordon and Levin. And what they did a year later is they did the same exact race, but they gave them carbohydrates. It could be orange juice. They could have been oranges or potatoes, just some form of bread, in some form of carbohydrate. Almost ubiquitously, they all performed better. They all went longer. Their times were faster. And so this was the first study that really said carbohydrates actually improve performance. Most people don't know this study exists. However, that was the emergence of it. But what it showed us is that exercise-induced hypoglycemia was a reason why carbohydrates could be utilized. However, the rationale behind that shifted in the 1960s because it wasn't so much that we learned something novel or new. It was that we discovered a new method, something called the Bergstrom muscle biopsy. So this researcher discovered the ability to develop a method to actually suction out muscle from muscle tissue using this a larger syringe that we give insulin with, and pulling out that muscle tissue, they discovered that in that muscle tissue was stored glucose into polysaccharide in the muscle. So these glucose molecules that are bound together, and that was glycogen. Glucose bound together in a tissue in the muscle. Clearly, if you found glucose bound together as an energy substrate and is stored, it must be for fuel, it must be for performance, it must be utilized for something related to the muscle's energetic needs, right? Well, there's certainly some truth to that. But what it also found is that they found that the levels of glucose in the muscle were associated with fatigue. Even to today, it's not causal, but it was always associated with fatigue. Lower levels meant you had early onset of fatigue, but it was never causal. Okay. Now, moving further on, they have the ability to use technologies where you put a mask on your face and you were able to assess the amount of oxygen consumed and carbon dioxide excreted, and you were able to determine the estimated amount of carbohydrates and fat being oxidized during fuel substrates and during fuel endurance exercise bouts and other forms of exercise. And those technologies have only become more refined. And what they have found is that athletes would often supposedly need very high levels of carbohydrate oxidation on these high intensity performance bouts. And so a lot of times when we think about what type of energy we need, we look at this crossover point, right? I'm sure if anyone can Google this right now, Google over crossover point. And the crossover point is this philosophy in exercise physiology that's taught for the last 3 decades or more that the higher the intensity of exercise, the more glucose would be required for that activity bout. Now, there's one big problem with that. If you and we've also written a manuscript on this. If you actually look at a lot of the studies that formulate that hypothesis, these are all in athletes. And what we find is that if you look outside of that construct, people are oxidizing much higher levels of carbohydrates at much lower intensities. And this idea of a crossover point only holds up if you only consider it in this very tight constraint, which is in these very controlled laboratory settings and endurance exercise athletes. However, if you look outside of that context, we've done a number of studies where there was all this literature in 2018 to 2021 that showed that these short-term ketogenic diets, these low carbohydrate diets, would impair performance. Now, keep in mind, a lot of studies actually never statistically proved impaired performance. They just showed a trend because they were very short-term trials, less than 3 weeks in duration, although they were able to capture some very high-end athletes, so elite race walkers, Olympic athletes. And they said they impaired performance. The problem is that a lot of these studies had a lot of confounders in them, right? One, the activity was not controlled. Two, the diet and caloric and macronutrient often a lot of these randomized controlled trials were not controlled, and they were always typically less than 3 weeks in duration. If you actually look back at the 1980s, there was this gentleman named Stephen Finney who conducted a trial in the 1980s that required athletes or cyclists, actually. And he was an avid cyclist himself. He was a medical doctor, and he was really curious about these diets himself. And what he did is he put these athletes on these low carbohydrate diets. And he told me the story. We're actually sitting on State Street, Nathan, actually talking about this with Dr. Finney. And we had a multi-day conversation about his journey and looking at this. And I remember we were sitting on State Street, by the way. If no one's familiar with State Street in Santa Barbara, it's this iconic place where you see and Santa Barbara in general is just iconic, but you see these really remarkable athletes just flying by all the time. It's this beautiful place. You can walk up and down. You see these, you can just hear the cranking of the bikes. And these are really nice bikes. These are more than some people's cars, right? There's just flying by him. And he would just look at him and say, man, I remember when, and then he'd go back in his Rolodex 40 years prior and say, when we were doing this study and we put these people on low carbohydrate diets, just like it was discovered in 2018 to 2021, these athletes would have terrible performance for the first 3 weeks. I would fly by them. They would have to get behind me and ride my tailwind, not tailwind, but right behind them, so they would have the advantage and win resistance and
the draft.
Draft. There you go. And then after 4 weeks, they would crank back up and start flying by me again. He's like, there was something special about the timeline on the diet. And now, 40 years post that timeline, we know all these massive metabolic changes that occur in a stepwise manner. From the second you go on a low carbohydrate diet, you see reductions in glucose, immediate reductions in insulin, increased in fat oxidation, increase in ketone production within the first 18 hours it's observed. And that just gets more and more progressive. But we see there's a lot of changes that don't occur until the 4-week mark. But suffice it to say, all the way back to the story is that, again, in 1920s, we found that carbohydrates improve performance. 1960s, we saw that it was a substrate in the muscle, and that the amount of substrate in the muscle in the form of glycogen was associated with fatigue. Going forward into the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond, we see that there's this ability to look at the estimations of carbohydrate oxidizing, fat oxidizing, that higher intensity exercise seemingly required higher levels of carbohydrate oxidation. However, you then confirm that, right? Because these studies, short-term studies, were showing, oh, look, you impair performance less than 3 weeks. But what we were so curious about is there was this clear epidemic in America where these highly processed foods, these higher carbohydrate diets that people were consuming, were often leading people to have adverse health. Now, we're not thinking athletes here, right? Because we're just thinking the general population. But the problem is that one of the stigmas associated with, let's say, doing a ketogenic diet, for some of the therapeutic benefits we've seen dating back 200 years in type 2 and type 1 diabetes, and obesity going back over 100 years, in epilepsy and neurological disorders going back to 1921. It has profound therapeutic potential, but people wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because of this association with impaired performance. Why need carbs to perform? And so we're really interested in that. Is that actually true if you actually consider some of the things that Dr. Stephen Finney had learned 40 years prior? What if we actually adapted these athletes? Okay, these are high-level athletes. We've had Ironman competitors come through. We've had, competitive collegiate athletes come through who are runners, and say, if you actually adapt them for 4 weeks or longer, and in a study environment, if you actually want to answer a research question, you need to control confounders. You need to control confounders of how many calories they're consuming. What's their body composition? Are you keeping that controlled? Is the activity controlled? Most of these studies don't do that. But what we did is we controlled the activity these athletes were doing throughout the entire study. We controlled the calories, their macronutrients. We also controlled their body composition, which was retained throughout the entire exercise duration. And the first study we did was 4 weeks. And we also had the same athlete doing both diets. Why is that so important? Well, you have genetics, you have environmental factors at home and outside that affect all of these variables, but we controlled all of them. And we had these athletes on the diet for 4 weeks, matching calories, body composition, activity, and beyond. And what we did is we said, okay, well, first thing we're interested in is there's this belief that you can't have the same level of very high intense performance. Okay, you can't go beyond 70% of your VO2 max. You're clearly going to have an impaired performance because the crossover point dictates that at this intensity level, the amount of fat being oxidized would be virtually zero, and that you'd be completely obligated on carbohydrates. But if you're doing a diet, like a ketogenic diet, where fat oxidation is through the roof, clearly you're going to have impaired performance. Well, we found that not only was there no difference in performance with a 1 mile time trial and 6x800 meter sprints, but during these athletic endeavors, at over 85% of their VO2 max, they were oxidizing the highest recorded levels of fat oxidation in the medical literature history on these diets. So it was showing that this idea that you could not oxidize high levels of fat during performance at long duration wasn't true if you adapted the athlete for long enough. Beyond that, their performance was equivalent. Now, that was interesting, but what was way more interesting than that is we put CGMs on these non-diabetic athletes. 30% of them who had no prior diagnosis had not only average but fasting CGMs across multiple CGMs within the same batch. We controlled them. We had capillary calibration of these devices. We did everything to control the variables that come along with CGM limitations. And these athletes were showing up, 30% of them, with fasting glucose levels over a 31-day period, not a single fasting blood glucose value, a 31-day average glucose level in the fasted window, consistent with prediabetes. So 30% of these athletes apparently had what appeared to be glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. Now, keep in mind, this was absolutely mind-blowing to us. Like, why would athletes who were lean, fit, body composition had nothing to do with it, age had nothing to do with it, but when we put them on the low carbohydrate diet, same athlete, same environment, same calories, everything, activity controlled, completely resolved those glucose values consistent with prediabetes. Now, that seems like, okay, that's nonsense. We know that if you are fit and you're exercising, you're immune to this. But actually, we've known for about 10 years is a phenomenon called the fit but unhealthy athlete, where athletes consuming are doing extreme levels of endurance exercise, high duration levels of activity, coupled with kind of more highly glycolytic forms of carbohydrates in the diet, and also coupled with other forms of stress, can actually form an unhealthy phenotype. But what we were finding is that they were actually presenting with glycemic values consistent with a subclinical diagnosis related to diabetes. And we ended up running a multi-study analysis to find that this was not actually completely foreign. We weren't the only people to be seeing this. In fact, some studies were seeing levels consistent upwards of anywhere from 0% to 60% of the cohorts they were looking at athletes were seeing this. This was very concerning. We know that there's examples like Lionel Sanders and others who have come out publicly and actually said, hey, look, I've developed prediabetes. Everything else is normal when my glucose levels are through the roof. And it's more complex than just carbs are not carbs, right? There's all the cluster of other things that are going on there that we hopefully may or may not have time to get into today. But suffice it to say, clearly, diet had impacts not just on, if you habituated to a diet long enough, no matter the amount of carbohydrates in the diet, this belief you had to have carbohydrates for 100 years didn't hold up. So the next thing that came out of this was, okay, well, you did it in short duration, high intensity exercise, whatever. That's fine. What about long duration, hitting the wall type of performance, multi-hour endurance performance? What happens then? And we're like, oh, okay, well, that's an interesting question. I thought that, of course, they wouldn't perform well in high intensity exercise, but now people are saying, well, yeah, sure, but what about long duration? So what did we do? We recruited Ironman completers, people who had completed an Ironman, they were competitors at the time, high levels of endurance, maybe not as much as Justin, you were doing, or Nathan, you were doing when you were in the professional leagues. Justin, you're still doing this, but Nathan, when you were doing this, still, nonetheless, very high level athlete, okay, competing at the time. And we said, okay, we're going to put them on the diet for 6 weeks. But at the end of that 6 weeks, we're controlling the same thing. The same athlete was doing both diets. This time, 6 weeks, not 4 weeks. We're controlling calories, controlling macronutrients, controlling activity, controlling all these things these other studies have historically said, hey, these diets are going to impair performance. We're not doing. And so when we control all these variables, at the end of that 6 weeks, we asked them to do a little bit of a grueling endeavor. Maybe not for you guys, but the average person who's an athlete, this would still be pretty grueling. We asked them to hit the wall, not once, not twice, but actually 8 different times. And so what we did is at the end of each diet, we said, okay, we want you to go to pure exhaustion. We want to get to the point where we're actually able to elucidate a key metrics of fatigue, either through glycogen, through carbohydrate oxidation being lowered, or through hitting what was historically shown 100 years ago, exercise-induced hypoglycemia. Well, number one, we did this across both diets, and we found that no matter the diet, the athletes performed exactly the same. Their performance time was identical, no matter what type of diet they had habituated to. That's critical, because it seemed like if you had a healthy diet and you stuck to it for long enough, your body got used to it and was able to perform at very high levels, regardless of the diet. Okay, that's number one. But then we said, okay, what happens if we give just enough carbohydrates? Not 120 grams per hour, not 60 grams per hour, which was prior gold standard recommendations, not even 30. We're going to give them the equivalent of 1 tablespoon of table sugar each hour. So 3.4 grams of glucose every 20 minutes, or 10 grams per hour. That was all we gave them, because the reason was we only wanted to give sufficient glucose to maintain glucose levels. That's it. Only enough to do that. Not enough to change carbohydrate oxidation levels, not enough to impact glycogen levels or insulin, just enough to trickle into the bloodstream to prevent hypoglycemia. And we did that both on the low carbohydrate diet and the high carbohydrate diet. And it increased performance 22% on both diets. There was no difference on what type of diet you had, whether you without carbohydrates. And guess what? There was no difference when you gave carbohydrates across the diets either. But when you gave just 10 grams per hour, just sufficient to prevent exercise-induced hypoglycemia, you got a 22% improvement across both diets. Okay, you didn't need 120 grams, you didn't need 60 grams. Only 10 grams did this. And what we actually did is looked at all the historical literature on this and say, what is the predominant factor that appears to lead to performance? Is it glycogen? Is it carb oxidation? Is it exercise-induced hypoglycemia? Some combination therein. Well, I will say it is clearly some combination therein. Okay, it's very obvious. It's not one singular factor. I mean, it's never almost one singular factor. But what appears to be the case in our study, and also our publication that will come out here soon, reviewing all the evidence, is it appears that even in type 1, obviously in type 1, you know this, if you go hypoglycemic, you're going to have impaired performance. There's no doubt about that, at least compared to if you didn't. But the same is true in non-type 1 athletes. We discovered over 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the therapeutic benefit of ketogenic diets in type 1 diabetes first. We also discovered the power of CGMs 2 decades before the general population discovered it in type 1 diabetes first. We also discovered the power of a poor night's sleep or multiple poor night's sleeps on insulin sensitivity, or medications and how it affects insulin sensitivity, or how exercise improved insulin sensitivity decades before it was ever published in the literature in type 1 diabetes first. And again, we've known that hypoglycemia impairs performance in type 1 diabetes, but now we know that it is also a key determinant of exercise performance in even those without type 1 diabetes. And so this opens up this question of, do you actually need 120 grams per hour or 60 grams per hour? Because what we found in this review as well is that when you give more carbohydrates, there appears to be no consistent evidence of the dose response that 60 is better than 30 or 120 is better than 60 or et cetera. There doesn't seem to be consistent literature on this. Doesn't mean it isn't going to improve Justin's performance or Nathan's performance, Alex's performance. Doesn't mean that it isn't. It just shows that the weight of the evidence is not agreeing with this idea that the recommendations should be that high or even higher than 10. We don't know that right now. And it seems like the physiology that you give more carbohydrates and the idea of sparing glycogen, as Alex has talked about, it's not doing that. It's actually paradoxically breaking it down. And so the way we think about carbohydrates is certainly going to change. The way we think they're improving performance is certainly going to change. There's no doubt they improve performance, but how much is needed and why is it improving performance is certainly in question.
No, I mean, that's so cool to hear. Just getting down to the nitty gritty of the results. And one of the things that I'm listening to you say is that it's a lot of like what your body's adapting to, what kind of diet your body's getting used to running on. And Andrew, after our conversation, I've been doing a lot of fasted training, and I've kind of shared with you some of my results. And I think a while back I was like, hey, I've been, doing a month of fasted runs, and I do the same flat run course, and I saw my splits, like my results ticking down, going faster and faster. And I found that to be mind blowing. And I think what you were alluding to via text was like, well, yeah, your body's getting used to that type of nutrition adaptation. So that's probably what you were showing. And so I love that because one of the things, that I'm an amateur athlete now. I do it. I'm a weekend warrior. I do it for health, for fitness, for just clarity of mind, for longevity of life. And so for me, playing around with, low carb training protocols is kind of fun because it's easier for me, right? It's easier for me to manage my blood sugars when I'm fasted training. And if I'm confident that I know that I'm going to get the gains that I want out of my lift, out of my riding, then for me, I kind of like the idea of pursuing that kind of exercise nutrition protocols. For Justin, it's a little bit different because he's trying to squeeze the absolute most out of his physiology. And so I guess that brings me to my next question. What do you think's driving that? So I'm going to step back a second. And, in the Tour de France, all the records are falling. When I say records, like all the they go over the same courses over the last 100 years. They've been doing the same climbs. Yeah. They've been doing the same. And in the last 5 years, all the mountaintop finishes have fallen drastically in just records. Even compared to when we know everybody was on EPO and performance enhancing drugs. Let's just assume that the Peloton's clean today. Fingers crossed. And what's the thing driving those times to fall, those records to fall? I've heard people say it's the new way people fuel. It's running on a higher octane, more gas. Let's just call sugar gas in this situation. Now it's funny because they are taking ketone supplements too, which is it's like, hey, let's just throw everything into the boat. But I guess my real question here, to kind of try to organize my ramble and turn it into a question is, what do you think is driving the current recommendations in those, in like professional cycling as an example? And I know triathletes are doing it too, where they're really like upping those carb intakes to, 120 grams an hour, 150 grams an hour. What do you think is driving that? Because it seems like there's new science that you're a part of that's showing, hey, there might be some advantages to training your body to be more efficient at fat oxidation.
So I actually question that the carb oxidation levels in all these athletes are ubiquitously going higher. And the reason I question that is if you actually look, like these are recorded races, like you can actually see them live. And a lot of these athletes, they're not, I'm not saying they're not, some aren't. Some are able to do this at certain periods of time, but a lot of them, you can actually watch it. You're actually watching the race. There's no way they're consuming that level of carbohydrates in those races. It's ecologically, 120 grams per hour is no joke. Like it's a real amount of work. Like it's no joke. It's so much work. And if you try to split it up optimally, at least how people think is optimal over certain cadences of time, let's say either 20 minutes or so, whatever the cadence is that someone recommends, because some of this says you should do this and some says you should do this. It's a tremendous amount of consumption. And actually,
just ask Justin. I mean, he's doing it. Justin, would you agree with that? Is it difficult to get in that many carbs per hour in a 200-mile, 9.5 hour race?
Yes and no. That's a nuanced question in itself. Yes, it is very tricky, and that is something that you have to do in training to build yourself up to be able to just purely digest that amount of carbohydrate per hour. I will say, with the way modern nutrition has evolved, even in the last 3 years, it's much easier to get to that high number of carbs per hour without having a massive quantity of food, just because the pure concentration of carbohydrate, plus it being split between both glucose and fructose to utilize both substrates, it's I don't want to say it's easy, but it's doable with a couple bottles of or a bottle and a half of high carb fuel plus some gels. It's easy to do this in a liquid format, but it is that I can see some skepticism around it, because if every bottle is not that high carb intake, which a lot of times you need to have water to dilute stuff as well, then you could be well under that 150 grams of carb per hour for a high level race. But it's case by case for sure.
And that's and so Justin, having actually done this, and I think it brought up a really good point, because I worked with a few elite athletes, some who have type 1, some who don't, and I'll say what everyone else is doing, right? But what I will say is that in the real world setting, oftentimes the recommended levels are almost ubiquitously never prescriptively hit. In the real world, you see them do these mountain climbs. There's a grueling race. It's near, no one's like, okay, I have to get this perfect. I mean, I'm not saying no one is. It's very rare that you're at this moment and you're like, okay, I'm more worried about what I'm consuming than the effort I'm putting in cognitively to the performance I'm giving, the focus I'm doing. All I'm getting at is that there's a lot more to this, right, than just the amount of carbohydrates, because that's a lot of what you hear is oh, look, the David Roach, is a well-known endurance runner, and he's very promotive of the high carb approach. But if you actually see him train, he trains like an animal. The training is different. The augmented tools, the shoes that are being utilized, the ergonomics of the actual bikes, the environment, the training programs, what we know about training and what we know works, the ability for athletes to prioritize things that go beyond nutrition and they go beyond exercise training, like sleep. One drink of alcohol can potentially disrupt sleep. Things like this that were never on people's radar are very much on people's radar, because it's on everyone's podcast in earbuds whenever they go somewhere. So these little things that legitimately are more than 1% on most people's performance barometer are now composite and in people's life. And so so when you ask Nathan, why are people getting better? I think, part of it is that I think people are getting funneled into sports that are uniquely genetically gifted in. So if you have a genetically gifted athlete and they're really good at particular sports and they happen to play, like LeBron James of basketball, right? If LeBron James wouldn't play football, he'd be really great at it. But maybe he lost an opportunity if he wasn't in basketball specifically, and so I think there's you can't ignore there's potential for that. I also think there's potential for all the other factors outside of nutrition that are leading to performance because of the awareness of it, because athletes are getting better coaching. Coaches are becoming more aware of the nuance that goes beyond exercise and nutrition. There's the periodization programs. as well. Like there's so much that goes into it. And beyond that, it's actually tools as well. Like I worked at and still have affiliation with the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, where they literally build ergonomic tools. And you can see the percentage improvement in just spring-loaded, I won't say spring-loaded, shoes that have more of a cushion, give, and then bounce. These things are not insignificant in their ability to enhance performance. They are real. The psychology. So when you saw the world record Berlin race being, I'm blanking on the name, but when the world record was broken in Berlin on the marathon run,
they were 2 hours, I think, on that race.
Yeah.
Did he go under 2? Because it was a down. I know Berlin was really close. It was the world record, anyways, but it was super fast. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and on that race, there's psychology. There was a car showing a red line of where you had to run. So now the cognitive effort is out the window. Not out the window, don't get me wrong. Okay, it's not like this is easy by any means, okay? I don't want to portray that. That's a false presentation. But there is a whole nother layer of, we know that your ability to focus and stay mentally, I don't say locked in, is the psychology during a race is a huge factor. In fact, one of the most consistent effects on sports performance is something called the placebo effect. So even if you take something and you believe it's helping you, is the most reliable way to improve your performance. If you believe it's helping you, it is more reliable in improving performance than if something actually improves performance. Because there's very few things that actually move the needle substantially in exercise performance, at least supplementally speaking, okay, like over-the-counter stuff. Outside of that, yeah, there's a lot of things. But over-the-counter, yeah, not so much, okay? On the elite end, yeah, we're talking like 0.5%, maybe 1%, and that does matter. That's first and second place right there. But again, Nathan, to your original question of what are the factors, I think it's a composite factor of a very nuanced conversation. But I want to circle this back for just a moment, because when we talk about nutrition, particularly in type 1 diabetes, there is a belief within the performance community at the high end. I'm familiar with some of that community that, okay, maybe having a little bit higher glucose is actually potentially better, because there is definitely some evidence that some of the best performers in the world who don't have type 1 are also, if you look at historical laboratory studies, you can see that people spike in glucose too. It's not like only type 1s are having high glucose levels, but it's very transient, super transient. And some of those athletes, so I'll leave that there. I won't say anything else. I'll just say leave that there. But there are clearly some athletes who are running higher glucose at the world record end as well, who don't have type 1 diabetes. However, there are a number of studies that have shown that, when we talk about type 1, we often talk about time and range, 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. And keep in mind, for your audience, that is a arbitrary kind of made up value. It is a value about realities of type 1 management, not because of biological certainties that 180 is some magical number, okay? It's actually based on epidemiology data, big populations saying that, okay, if you go higher than that, it's associated with increased comorbidity and mortality. Not because that number is magical. And it's obviously different per person. Just like we know hypoglycemia values where you actually experience symptoms can range anywhere in the mid-70s to like high 50s, depending on the person. The neuroendocrine counter-regulatory response is all over the map, and it's all individualized, okay? So at the end of the day, everything is individualized. We all know that the body is a very adaptive tool, and that you will adapt to what you're giving it. And I would argue genetics and training are so much more important, in my opinion, than the magic of nutrition. Nutrition is paramount. If you have poor nutrition, it will impair performance. But I believe if you have a well-formulated diet based on the evidence, that you can perform equivalently based on how we understand the evidence is now, regardless of the diet, if it's well-formulated, okay? But what you do supplementally before exercise is certainly in question at the amount, because we know carbohydrates help, but how much? And we also know things like ketones. There's companies like one of the best marketed ones is Ketone IQ from HVMN, but there are others, right? And they increase ketone bodies. And there's a whole nother fuel system. We've done a lot of research on that. I mean, I've published over 12 different studies in exogenous ketones to date in athletes and non-athletes. And there's definitely something of interest there. We were hearing back a decade and a half ago about the interest in the high-level cyclist teams interested in this a long time ago. So it's not like new. This is something that people have been doing for quite some time. And earlier, Justin talked about glucose and fructose. Well, the rationale behind multiple forms of glucose or sugar in drinks is because different receptors bring them through the intestinal lining. And the same with ketones, it uses a completely different receptor. And so there's always been a philosophy in sports that you can use more than one fuel substrate at the same time. And if you could, that'd be more benefit. And so there's a lot of things to consider in the nutrition paradigm also. But to simple it down for the audience, and to bring in something that we may have to leave on a more of a cliffhanger note, there is now decent amount of evidence that says that if you consume high levels of carbohydrates during exercise, it can actually, and you have higher than normal glucose values, even within the time and range, so in like 160 milligrams per deciliter range, it can actually decrease your metabolic flexibility during rides. It can lock you into high levels of carbohydrate oxidation and reduce your ability to actually get into fat oxidation just by high glucose levels alone, even before you get above 180. There's also evidence that has emerged that shows that getting to 160 milligrams per deciliter can reduce the ability significantly to clear lactate levels. Obviously, that has implications in performance. So the glucose levels in circulation alone, independent of insulin, have a clear metabolic effect. And the implications with glucose plus insulin is much more robust, much more nuanced than that. So when it comes to sports performance, there's a lot to consider, or maybe reconsider, with what is necessary, how much is necessary, because I'm not going to sit here and say to Justin, hey, Justin, you should go to 10 grams per hour. Like, I don't think, first off, he's not going to listen to me anyways, nor should he, because at the end of the day, what's working for someone works for them. And in Justin's case, there's something real on the line, right? If you're going to go to a lower carbohydrate diet strategy, you want to adapt to it. You want to make sure you're working with someone who knows what they're doing. There's a whole bunch in this. It's not just like, oh, reduce carbs. It's not that simple. In fact, when people do that, that's when the mistake happens. They don't realize how to formulate it appropriately. In type 1, they don't know that you switch insulin strategies as well. There's a lot of things that go into this. You just don't lower carbs. I hear from people all the time. Oh, it didn't work for me. I'm like, okay, what'd you do? Like, I just reduced carbs, and this is happening. I'm like, yeah, but it's not just that. There's a whole lot else that goes into it, and it's more nuanced. So,
well, just like there's a whole strategy to high carb training protocols. There's, I'm sure, as much strategy, if not more, and training. Like we just talked about, Justin has to train his gut and his body and his whole system on the bike to be able to consume that. I think the same intensity should go into switching to a low carb. And like I said, I've been playing around with it just because I'm a weekend warrior now, and I just am doing it for my N01 experiments that I do on myself, and having some fun with it. But man, Andrew, that was awesome. Thanks for giving us the download on that science that I think a lot of us are unfamiliar with, and so that's definitely something to dig into deeper. Like I said, you left us on kind of a cliffhanger, like you said, but man, super informative, really fun. Hey, I know we've got a hard stop here. We always end these podcasts with a little fun because we like to be living with type 1 diabetes as a game. And so we always have a little competition amongst the people on the podcast who's got the better blood sugar at the moment. So, do you mind sharing with us where you're at? I'll go first. Yeah. So I'm looking at my CGM. I've got 88 with an arrow trending straight across. I think our
you gotta show it. Nathan, you gotta show it. I don't want to hear it. You gotta show it. Okay, there you go. All right, there you go.
Can you see it? It's a little blurry. Here, get it up. Okay, 88 arrow across.
Let's see here. Can I focus?
Oh, 96. All right,
yeah.
He's gonna win. I think Andrew's got this one. I'm 172. So
yeah, our target is. Do you remember the old Abbott Freestyle Light BG meters? The ad was always like 99. So we just go off of that, and the target is 99 for us. So that's the number we go for.
I'm going to leave with another cliffhanger. The idea of the optimal blood sugar is absolutely a lot of misinformation about optimal blood sugar. I would actually contend that the optimal blood sugar is when you look at athletes who are healthy and wear CGMs, because everyone in type 1 looks at a CGM, but they're looking at static plasma values in a different compartment and non-type 1 individuals who aren't using CGMs for a comparative. What you should be looking for is look at athletes who are fit wearing a CGM. And when you look at that data, you actually find that those athletes are running somewhere between 90 and 100 milligrams per deciliter throughout the 24-hour window. So this idea of optimal blood sugar being like 80 or 90 or 100 or 100, whatever it is, you have to look at the measurement technique and what is optimal. I might actually do a whole thing on this. Maybe a debate. Maybe you could bring someone who would debate this. That would be entertaining.
Okay, in your opinion, then what should our target number be? We were going off of 99. What's your thought?
I think that if you don't have diabetes and you're listening to this podcast, you should be targeting a fasted value upon waking, probably below 90, somewhere between 80 and 90 milligrams per deciliter, because there's a dose-dependent response in fasting blood sugars, even in the above 90 to above 100 levels to 110, 120, dose-dependent response and kind of not optimal adverse kind of changes in that direction.
Yeah.
In type 1, though, there's a huge caveat. Usually, now obesity is rampant in type 1 too, but historically it wasn't. And so the only thing that was historically different is peripheral insulin. So you can have some potential insulin resistance because of high peripheral insulin, but predominantly high and variable glucose levels. That was the one thing that was different. You didn't have like high adiposity levels, high body mass index, high lipid values, high amino acids floating in the blood like in type 2 diabetes. You just had higher blood glucose levels. Higher and variable blood glucose levels. So when we talk about what's optimal and someone's like, okay, well, you should target like 80 or 90, I would say as carefully as I can, the optimal blood sugar is the one you can maintain as low as possible without increasing the risk for hypoglycemia above 4%. And that's why I'll leave it at that. But I will also indicate that for each person, that's a little bit different. But if you want an actual number, the numbers in athletes who are wearing CGMs, okay, because a single stick value is meaningless in type 1 diabetes. Like that is meaningless. More than meaningless, maybe.
It is. Of course. Yeah, we all know that now.
Yeah, but with a CGM, which is an interstitial value, which is an indirect measure, but very good, especially if you cross-reference it to a finger stick value, that value in athletes is around 90 to 110 over a 24-hour window. So if your mean glucose value, if you're not having robustly high levels of hypoglycemia doing that, which a lot of people would, okay, particularly if you're doing higher carbohydrate approaches or you don't have nuance or you're not like managing this very frequently, at least based on the evidence, everyone's different, especially the optimizers are more able to get into these ranges with their techniques. But either way, around 100, 90 to 100 is where most people who are healthy and fit are sitting on a CGM value over the 24-hour window over multiple days on average. And that's the best way to reference it. Now, if you're not talking about athletes, the value is closer to 100. But athletes is closer to the low 90 range. But again, if you're increasing your risk for hypoglycemia all the time, is that a trade-off really worth it? Like, obviously not.
Well, for our game, our target game, we definitely, since we all have CGM, we're very blessed to be able to have this technology. We definitely play off of the trends and where we're headed. So, for instance, the other night we recorded at like 8:30. I think we finished at like 9:30, and I was 120 straight across, and Justin I think was 90 with an arrow trending down, and I took the win because I'm like, hey, we're going to bed, and you're headed for trouble, and I'm right where I want to be. Right. So there is caveats and there is that trending, and it's
I don't know. I think Justin won because of his hair. You see his hair? Like he's gotten you, he's destroying you right now in this.
I woke up like this. It's
indeed. Well, he's he's getting on TV in the professional cycling ranks, and I'm just hanging out with my family on the weekend. So I don't have to look that cool.
Do not downgrade that lifestyle, Nathan. That's the lifestyle everyone should aspire to. But that said, Justin's out there representing the type 1 diabetes community publicly, and it's an honor to get to speak with you, both of you guys, because you both done this, as well as Alex as well. So it's an honor to speak with you guys. Truly. Nothing like speaking with other people with type 1 diabetes and sharing the successes, lack of successes. That's also important because we all have them.
That's how we learn right there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you. That was the perfect way to close it. Hey, have a great rest of your day. And man, we'll be in touch, I'm sure.
All right, guys. Honor, truly.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.